My name is Margaret, and I am 68 years old. As a retired wilderness guide, I built a life of fierce independence deep in the Colorado mountains, navigating challenging terrains that would intimidate men half my age. For 43 years, I lived self-sufficiently in my beloved secluded cabin, surrounded by towering pines and crystal-clear streams. I raised my only daughter, Lisa, with the same values I lived by teaching her resilience, self-reliance, and respect for nature's power. I provided for her tirelessly, working as a guide for hikers and hunters, always believing that nurturing true independence was the greatest gift I could give her. My cabin wasn't just my home, it was my sanctuary, my connection to everything that made life meaningful. Then during a brutal February storm, a severe fall while checking my solar panels left me injured and isolated for 48 terrifying hours in sub-zero temperatures. When Lisa finally arrived after my emergency beacon activated, her resentment was immediate and palpable. David, her husband, wasted no time in coldly proposing that I be moved into Sunny Meadows, a low-cost nursing home on the other side of the state. "Mom, you're a burden we can't handle anymore," Lisa said, her words cutting deeper than any mountain wind. David was even more brutal. "She's sucking us dry financially. We have $150,000 in credit card debt, and frankly, she's losing her mind." My grandson Ethan looked at me with disgust and said, "Grandma is so annoying. Why doesn't she just go away? She smells like mothballs, and she's gross." My independence, my dignity, my very humanity felt stripped away in that moment. I was no longer Margaret the mountain guide. I was just a burden to be disposed of. Yet as despair threatened to consume me in my weakened state, the resourcefulness that had kept me alive through countless wilderness emergencies began to surface. What Lisa, David, Ethan, and their allies didn't know was my secret weapon: decades of meticulous journals documenting my complete financial self-sufficiency, and most crucially, my hiking GPS device that had inadvertently recorded their private conversations during the rescue, capturing their cold discussion of financial motives and their shocking lack of basic human compassion. My old friend Eleanor, a retired elder law attorney who lived just down the mountain, had always told me to call if I ever needed help. This time, their calculated plot to strip away my autonomy wouldn't just unravel. It would expose their heartless greed and prove that independence and justice could triumph over manipulation and cruelty. 3 weeks after my fall, I found myself trapped in Lisa's sterile suburban home, surrounded by beige walls and artificial lighting that felt like a prison after decades of mountain sunrises. My broken ribs were healing slowly, and every movement reminded me of my temporary vulnerability. I had hoped this recovery period would bring us closer together, that Lisa would remember the strong, capable woman who had raised her. Instead, I felt like an unwelcome intruder in a home where I was barely tolerated. The morning everything changed started when I carefully made my way to the kitchen, determined to prepare my own breakfast, as I had done every day for the past 68 years. Lisa was already there with David, their faces tense with the kind of conversation that stops abruptly when someone enters the room. "Mom," Lisa said without looking at me, her voice carrying the exasperated tone one might use with a difficult child. "We need to talk about your situation. David and I have been discussing your future, and we've made some decisions." I lowered myself carefully into a chair, my ribs protesting the movement. "What kind of decisions, honey? I thought we agreed I'd recover here for a few weeks and then return to my cabin once I'm stronger." David's laugh was harsh and cold, devoid of any warmth or familial affection. "Margaret, let's be realistic here. You're 68 years old, you live alone in the middle of nowhere, and you just proved you can't take care of yourself. Lisa and I simply cannot handle this burden anymore." The word burden hit me like a physical blow. This was the same man who had eaten countless meals at my table, who had brought his children to my cabin every summer to experience the wilderness I loved so deeply. Now, he was looking at me like I was nothing more than an expensive problem to be solved. "David," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the growing panic in my chest, "I understand this is difficult, but I've been independent my entire life. This fall was an accident, not a sign that I can't care for myself. My cabin has everything I need, and I know those mountains better than anyone." David's expression grew even colder as he pulled out a folder of documents. "Lisa, we simply can't handle this anymore," he said, speaking about me as if I weren't sitting right there. "Your mother is a massive financial burden. She's lost her independence, and frankly, she's losing her mind. The medical bills from her fall are already overwhelming us, and she's sucking us dry financially. We have $150,000 in credit card debt that we can't manage." He opened the folder and spread out glossy brochures on the kitchen table. "We found a solution. Sunny Meadows is a very affordable assisted living facility. It's designed for people exactly like your mother, people who can no longer live independently." I stared at the brochures in horror. Sunny Meadows looked like every nightmare image of institutional care I had ever imagined: sterile hallways, shared rooms, patients in wheelchairs staring blankly at television screens. This wasn't assisted living. This was a warehouse for unwanted elderly people. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and outrage. "I don't need assisted living. I need time to heal from a temporary injury. Lisa, you know me. I've always taken care of myself, always been self-sufficient. This cabin isn't just my home, it's my life, my connection to everything that matters to me. Don't you remember all the sacrifices I made for you, all the times I put your needs before my own?" Lisa's response broke my heart, more than David's cruelty ever could. She couldn't meet my eyes as she spoke, her voice weak and uncertain. "Mom, it's just too much for us to handle. We love you, but our lives are already overwhelming. With work, the kids, our financial problems. You're making our lives more difficult, and frankly, you're making us miserable. We need to think about our own family first." The kitchen door burst open, and Ethan, my 15-year-old grandson, stumbled in looking for breakfast. When he saw me sitting at the table, his face twisted with the kind of casual cruelty that only teenagers can master. "Oh, great-grandma's here again," he said loudly, making sure his parents could hear his disdain. "Why is she always here now? She smells like mothballs and old lady perfume. It's so gross. My friends think it's weird that we have some crazy old lady living with us." Chloe, my 13-year-old granddaughter, giggled from the doorway. "Ethan's right, Mom. Grandma is kind of embarrassing. She wears those weird outdoor clothes and talks about hiking all the time. None of my friends' grandparents are like that." The casual dismissal in their voices was devastating. These were children I had taught to fish, to identify animal tracks, to appreciate the majesty of a mountain sunrise. Now they saw me as nothing more than an embarrassing burden, an obstacle to their comfortable suburban lifestyle. But the worst humiliation came from outside the family. Brenda, Lisa's best friend and neighbor, had apparently been discussing my situation with anyone who would listen. I overheard her on the phone later that morning, her voice carrying through the thin walls of Lisa's house. "Poor Lisa," Brenda was saying with false sympathy. "Her mother is just so demanding and impossible to deal with. The woman has completely lost her mind after that fall. She keeps insisting she can live alone in some cabin in the mountains, but anyone can see she's not competent anymore. Such a burden on Lisa and David, who are such good people. They're trying to be patient, but honestly, how much should adult children be expected to sacrifice for a parent who refuses to accept reality? Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of my dignity. I was being portrayed as a delusional old woman clinging to an independence I no longer possessed, rather than a temporarily injured person who had lived successfully on her own for decades. The systematic campaign to make me feel unwelcome escalated quickly. David and Lisa began leaving Sunny Meadows brochures everywhere. I might see them highlighting costs and specialized care for difficult patients. They started discussing my situation within earshot, using phrases like, "for her own safety," and "we have no choice." Most devastatingly, they began making decisions about my possessions without my consent. When I asked about some personal items I wanted from my cabin, Lisa informed me that they had already moved some of your things to a storage unit for safekeeping. For what things? I asked, my heart pounding with dread. Just some of the outdoor equipment and old furniture, David said dismissively. Things you won't need anymore. We didn't want them to get damaged sitting in an empty cabin all winter. But I knew it was more than that. They were systematically erasing my connection to my former life, making it harder for me to imagine returning to my mountain sanctuary. Every decision was being made without my input, every aspect of my autonomy slowly stripped away under the guise of caring for my welfare. As I lay in the guest room that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant hum of suburban life, I felt the walls of my independence crumbling around me. But somewhere deep inside, the part of me that had survived blizzards and mountain emergencies began to stir. I was Margaret Thompson, and I had not spent 43 years in the wilderness learning to survive just to be defeated by my own family's greed and callousness. The fight for my freedom was just beginning. The escalation of David and Lisa's cruelty reached new depths during my 4th week of recovery at their house. What had begun as reluctant hospitality transformed into a systematic campaign to strip away every connection I had to my former life. The pretense of caring for my welfare evaporated, replaced by a cold calculation that chilled me to my bones. I was sitting in the living room, carefully working through the physical therapy exercises my doctor had prescribed when David burst through the front door, carrying a manila folder thick with official-looking documents. His face carried the expression of a man who had just solved a particularly troublesome problem. "Margaret," he announced without preamble, "we've made a decision about your cabin situation. The property needs to be sold immediately to cover your overwhelming medical expenses and reduce the financial burden you've placed on our family." The words hit me like an avalanche. My cabin, my sanctuary, the place where I had built my entire life was being discussed like a commodity to be liquidated. "David, what are you talking about? My medical bills are covered by Medicare and my supplemental insurance. And the cabin isn't a burden, it's my home." Lisa entered from the kitchen, avoiding my eyes as she had for days. "Mom, you're not being realistic about your financial situation. The costs of your care, the ongoing medical expenses, the fact that you can't live independently anymore, it all adds up to more than you can handle." David opened his folder and spread out documents across the coffee table. "We've had the property appraised," he said, pointing to an official-looking form. "In the current market, especially given its remote location and the condition of the structures we're looking at, maybe $200,000 if we're lucky. That should cover the immediate costs and give us something to work with for your long-term care expenses." I stared at the appraisal in shock. $200,000. My cabin sat on 43 acres of pristine mountain property with water rights and established wildlife corridors. Comparable properties in the area had sold for well over $500,000 in recent years. This wasn't an appraisal. It was a deliberate undervaluation designed to facilitate a quick sale. This can't be right, I said, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. David, you know that property is worth much more than this. We're talking about prime mountain acreage with a fully renovated cabin and established infrastructure. David's smile was as cold as a winter morning. Margaret, you're not thinking clearly about this. Remote properties like yours are hard to sell, especially when they require so much maintenance and specialized knowledge to operate. We need to be realistic about market values and move quickly before the property becomes even more of a liability. But it was what I overheard later that evening that revealed the true scope of their betrayal. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from the stress and the ongoing recovery from my injuries, when voices from the living room drifted up through the heating vents. David was on the phone, and his words made my blood run cold. The old lady's cabin is going to be a gold mine. He was saying, his voice filled with the satisfaction of someone who had just pulled off a clever scheme. We'll dump it fast, using that lowball appraisal. Tell her it's to cover medical expenses, but the reality is we'll probably get $500,000 or more from the right buyer. That'll completely pay off our credit card debt and leave us with a nice cushion. There was a pause as he listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. Then he continued, the beauty of it is that once she's in Sunny Meadows, she'll have no legal standing to contest anything. We'll have power of attorney, and she'll be just another confused old lady whose family had to make difficult decisions for her own good. The chilling clarity of their plan hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about my welfare or my ability to live independently. This was a calculated scheme to steal my life's work, my sanctuary, my very identity, all to solve their financial problems, while disposing of me in the cheapest institutional care they could find. As I lay there in the darkness, struggling to process the magnitude of their betrayal, my mind drifted back to a secret I had carried for over 20 years, a sacrifice I had made that none of them knew about. The irony of my current situation was almost unbearable when I considered what I had once given up to protect Lisa. 23 years ago, when Lisa was 25 and working as a junior accountant for a prestigious firm, she made a catastrophic mistake that threatened to destroy her career and land her in prison. Desperate to prove herself and climb the corporate ladder, she had falsified expense reports and diverted client funds into her personal accounts, accumulating nearly $75,000 in fraudulent claims. When the internal audit discovered the discrepancies, Lisa came to me in tears, terrified, and facing criminal charges that would have ruined her life. The company was prepared to prosecute to the full extent of the law, and the local newspapers were already sniffing around the story of young professional corruption. I didn't hesitate. Using every skill I had learned in 40 years of wilderness survival and self-reliance, I liquidated my entire retirement savings, the money I had been carefully accumulating for my dream expedition to guide groups through the Amazon rainforest. $75,000 gone in a matter of days. But it wasn't just the money. I used my connections in the outdoor industry, my reputation as a trusted guide, my knowledge of legal loopholes to create a paper trail that made it appear the missing funds had been donated by an anonymous benefactor who wanted to help Lisa start her own business. I forged documents, created false correspondence, and risked my own reputation to deflect blame away from my daughter. The criminal charges disappeared. Lisa's career was saved. She met David 2 years later, started her family, built the comfortable suburban life she had always wanted. And I never told her the full extent of what I had sacrificed to protect her, allowing her to believe that her problems had been solved by good fortune and a mysterious benefactor. Now lying in her guest room while she and her husband plotted to steal my home and abandon me to institutional care, the bitter irony was almost more than I could bear. I had given up my dreams, my financial security, and 20 years of Amazon adventures to save her from the consequences of her greed. Now she was repaying that sacrifice by participating in an even more elaborate scheme to destroy what remained of my independence. The next morning brought fresh cruelties. When I attempted to call my neighbor Eleanor to ask about the condition of my cabin, David intercepted the call. "Margaret, you're becoming quite paranoid about your property," he said with the condescending tone one might use with a confused child. "We're handling everything that needs to be handled. These obsessive concerns about your cabin are exactly why we're worried about your mental state." Lisa nodded in agreement, though she still couldn't meet my eyes. "Mom, David's right. You're fixating on things that are being taken care of. Dr. Williams said that anxiety and paranoid thinking are common after traumatic injuries in elderly patients." When I tried to express my concerns about the appraisal, about their plans for my property, about my desire to return to my home, they exchanged knowing glances that made my skin crawl. "We've been in contact with Mr. Jenkins from Adult Protective Services," David announced. "He's going to be doing a wellness evaluation to help determine the best care plan for your situation. Adult Protective Services." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. They were building a case for my incompetence, creating an official record that would support their claim that I was unable to make my own decisions. That afternoon, they presented me with a folder of legal documents that they claimed were standard care planning forms. The paperwork was dense and confusing, filled with legal terminology that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. "These documents just formalize the care arrangements we've discussed," Lisa explained, though her voice lacked conviction. "They ensure that if something happens to you, we'll be able to make decisions that are in your best interest." I tried to read through the forms, but my eyes were tired and the small print seemed to swim on the page. What I could make out looked like power of attorney documents, medical directives, and financial authorizations that would give them complete control over my assets and my care. "I need time to review these with my own attorney," I said, setting the papers aside. David's face darkened. "Margaret, this is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that concerns us. We're your family. We're trying to help you. If you can't trust us to act in your best interest, then maybe Mr. Jenkins needs to be more involved in these decisions." The threat was clear: sign the documents or face a competency evaluation that would strip away my rights entirely. I was trapped between cooperation and forced compliance, with no good options visible on either path. That night, as I listened to them discussing the final details of their plan through the heating vents, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who had survived mountain storms and wild animal encounters was not going to be defeated by her own family's greed and manipulation. They had underestimated me, forgotten that I was still the same person who had spent decades navigating treacherous terrain and surviving in conditions that would break most people. They had my GPS device, but they didn't know about the recordings it had made. They had legal documents, but they didn't know about Eleanor's expertise in elder law. Most importantly, they didn't know that beneath their careful plan to portray me as a confused, dependent old woman, the resourceful wilderness guide who had raised Lisa was very much alive and preparing to fight back. The end came with the mechanical efficiency of a military operation designed to leave no room for resistance or appeal. 6 weeks after my fall, I was discharged from David and Lisa's house, not to return to my beloved cabin, but to be transferred directly to Sunny Meadows Assisted Living Facility, 3 hours away from everything and everyone I had ever known. The morning of my expulsion, I woke to find strangers in the house, 2 orderlies from a medical transport company, and a social worker I had never met. My personal belongings had been packed into 2 small suitcases while I slept, and everything else I owned was apparently being sent to storage for safekeeping. Mrs. Thompson, the social worker, said, with the kind of professional sympathy that felt practiced and hollow, "I'm Sarah Martinez from County Social Services. We're here to help facilitate your transition to a care environment that better meets your current needs." I struggled to sit up in bed, my healing ribs protesting the sudden movement. "I don't need a care environment. I need to go home to my cabin. This is all a terrible misunderstanding." Sarah Martinez consulted her clipboard with the detached efficiency of someone processing paperwork rather than dealing with a human life. "Mrs. Thompson, your family has provided extensive documentation regarding your inability to live independently following your recent injury. The assessment indicates that you require round-the-clock supervision and specialized care that cannot be provided in your previous living situation." Lisa stood in the doorway, but she couldn't look at me directly. When our eyes met for a brief moment, I saw guilt and shame warring with determination on her face. "Mom, this is really for the best. Sunny Meadows has trained staff who can help you with things we just can't manage." "What things?" I demanded, my voice growing stronger despite my physical weakness. "I've been living independently for 43 years. I built my own cabin. I manage my own finances. I take care of my own medical needs. What exactly do you think I can't manage?" David appeared behind Lisa, holding the same manila folder he had carried throughout this nightmare. "Margaret, your hiking boots compass and expedition journals have been deemed inappropriate for your new living situation. The facility has specific guidelines about what residents can and cannot keep in their rooms." The casual destruction of my identity was breathtaking in its cruelty. My hiking boots had carried me across thousands of mountain miles. My compass had guided me through terrain that would terrify most people. My expedition journals contained 4 decades of wilderness knowledge, observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, survival techniques that I had planned to pass down to future generations of guides. "Those aren't just possessions," I said, my voice breaking. "They're my life, my work, my identity. You can't just take them away and pretend I'm someone else." But they could, and they were. The orderlies helped me dress in clothes I didn't recognize, generic sweatpants, and a cardigan that felt foreign against my skin. My own clothes, the practical outdoor wear that had been my uniform for decades, were apparently unsuitable for the facility environment. As they wheeled me toward the transport vehicle, I caught sight of Mrs. Eleanor Vance, my neighbor and dear friend, standing on her front porch. Eleanor was 82 years old, but her mind was sharp as a tack, and her career as an elder law attorney had given her insights into exactly the kind of situation I was facing. She was crying as she watched the orderlies load me into what was essentially a medical prison transport. I tried to call out to her, tried to wave, but I was too weak, and the restraints on the wheelchair made movement impossible. Lisa and David deliberately positioned themselves between the transport vehicle and Eleanor's line of sight, blocking any chance for communication. In that agonizing moment, watching Eleanor's horrified face disappear behind my family's bodies, I understood the complete scope of their betrayal. They weren't just taking my home and my possessions. They were severing every connection I had to my former life, isolating me so thoroughly that no one would even know what had happened to me. The 3-hour drive to Sunny Meadows passed in a blur of highways and strip malls that felt like traveling to another planet. When we finally arrived, the facility looked exactly like the nightmare I had imagined, a low institutional building surrounded by chain link fence with small windows and the kind of architecture that prioritized efficiency over humanity. My room was a sterile space I would share with another woman, furnished with 2 narrow beds, 2 small dressers, and a single window that looked out on the facility's parking lot. The walls were painted that particular shade of pale green that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at it. "Mrs. Thompson," the intake nurse said as she reviewed my file, "you'll be participating in our structured activity program, which includes crafts, television time, and supervised walks in our secure courtyard. Meals are served in the common dining room at scheduled times, and all medical needs will be handled by our staff. Structured activities, supervised walks, scheduled meals." Every word was a chain, every policy, a bar on the prison they were calling my new home. I had gone from being a self-sufficient wilderness guide to being an inmate whose every movement would be monitored and controlled. But it was that night, lying in the narrow institutional bed, while my roommate's labored breathing filled the darkness, that the full weight of my sacrifice finally crushed me. In the privacy of my own tortured thoughts, I confronted the most painful secret of my entire life, the choice that made Lisa's betrayal not just heartbreaking, but cosmically cruel. 28 years ago, 2 years after my husband's death, I met Dr. James Richardson at a wilderness conservation conference in Denver. James was a renowned environmentalist who had spent his career protecting endangered habitats across the globe. He was brilliant, passionate, and shared my deep love for the natural world in ways my husband never had. James offered me a partnership that would have transformed my life completely. Not just marriage, though we both knew that was where our relationship was heading, but a chance to work alongside him on conservation projects across 6 continents. We would have spent our lives traveling to remote locations, documenting endangered ecosystems, training local guides, and contributing to scientific research that could have made a real difference in protecting the world's remaining wilderness areas. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt alive again, filled with purpose and joy that extended beyond my daily survival in the mountains. James understood my need for independence while offering a partnership of equals 2 people who could accomplish more together than either could alone. The life he offered would have meant financial security, intellectual stimulation, and the kind of meaningful work that I had always dreamed of doing. We would have published books together, consulted on international conservation projects, and left a legacy that extended far beyond the boundaries of my small mountain community. But Lisa, who was 24 at the time and struggling with the aftermath of her father's death, begged me not to leave Colorado. She claimed she couldn't handle another loss, couldn't cope with the idea of me building a new life with someone else. She made me feel guilty for even considering my own happiness when she needed me to be available, to be the constant maternal presence that would help her heal from her grief. "Mom, please don't abandon me too," she had pleaded with tears in her eyes. "I know Dad's gone, but you're all I have left. If you leave with this man, it'll be like losing both my parents." So I chose her over my own future. I turned down James's offer, ended our relationship before it could fully develop, and committed myself to being the ever-present mother that Lisa claimed she needed. I convinced myself that I was making a noble sacrifice, that putting my daughter's emotional needs before my own desires was what good mothers do. 28 years of potential joy, intellectual partnership, meaningful work, and financial security, all sacrificed because I believed my daughter needed me more than I needed my own fulfillment. James went on to marry a fellow researcher and accomplished amazing things in conservation biology. I remained in my mountain cabin proud of my independence, but always wondering what might have been. Now, lying in that sterile facility bed while my daughter counted the profits from selling my life's work, the cruel irony was almost unbearable. I had given up my chance at love partnership and meaningful contribution to the world because Lisa convinced me she couldn't survive without my constant presence, and she was repaying that sacrifice by discarding me the moment I became inconvenient. The woman who had begged me not to abandon her was now abandoning me in the cruelest way possible, not just to institutional care, but to complete isolation from everything that had given my life meaning. Every choice I had made, every sacrifice I had accepted, every dream I had postponed had been for her benefit. And this was how she chose to honor that devotion. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the institutional sounds of a place designed to warehouse unwanted elderly people, I felt something familiar stirring inside me. The same survival instinct that had kept me alive through blizzards and wildlife encounters was awakening, and with it came a cold, calculating fury. They had my hiking boots, but they didn't have my knowledge. They had my compass, but they didn't have my sense of direction. They had my expedition journals, but they didn't have my memory. And most importantly, they had no idea that Eleanor Vance was not just my neighbor, but one of the most respected elder law attorneys in the state. Margaret Thompson, the mountain guide, who had never been defeated by any terrain, was not going to be defeated by her own family's greed. The fight for my freedom and dignity was about to begin, and they had no idea what kind of enemy they had just created. The reality of life at Sunny Meadows revealed itself with the slow horror of watching a wildfire consume everything you've ever loved. What had been presented to me as specialized care was actually a systematic regime of neglect designed to warehouse unwanted elderly people with maximum efficiency and minimum cost. My call, light the red button that was supposed to summon help when I needed assistance, became a cruel joke. I would press it when the pain from my healing ribs became unbearable, when I needed help getting to the bathroom, when the crushing loneliness threatened to overwhelm me completely. Sometimes I waited 3 hours before anyone responded. More often, no one came at all. "Mrs. Thompson, you need to be more patient," the overworked aide would say when she finally arrived, her voice carrying the exasperation of someone who dealt with too many needy patients and not enough time. "We have a lot of residents to care for, and you can't expect immediate attention for every little thing." Every little thing. That's what my pain had become, what my basic human needs were reduced to in their minds. The medication that was supposed to help my ribs heal properly was consistently delayed, sometimes by hours, leaving me curled in my narrow bed, trying to breathe through agony that felt like knives stabbing into my chest with every movement. The hygiene situation was perhaps the most degrading aspect of my new existence. Showers were scheduled once a week, whether you needed them or not, and if you missed your slot due to illness or mobility issues, you simply had to wait until the next week. The staff seemed to view basic cleanliness as a privilege rather than a right, and I found myself developing painful bed sores from being left in soiled clothing for hours at a time. "Your family doesn't visit much, do they?" one of the nurses commented during my second week at Sunny Meadows. She was changing my bedding with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. We see a lot of residents whose families dump them here and then disappear. Makes you wonder what kind of people would abandon their own mother like that. The casual cruelty of her observation hit me like a physical blow. Not only was I trapped in this place, but the staff saw me as one of the forgotten ones, the elderly people whose families had discarded them without a second thought. The fact that they were right made it infinitely worse. But the most devastating blow came through social media, where I discovered that my beloved cabin, my sanctuary, had been not just sold, but deliberately desecrated. A kind nurse showed me Brenda's Facebook posts on her phone, thinking it might cheer me up to see updates about my former home. What I saw instead made me physically sick. David and Lisa had sold my property for over $500,000, but rather than treating it with the respect it deserved, they had turned it into a vacation rental. The photos showed strangers trampling through rooms where I had spent decades building a life of purposeful solitude. Worse still, the garden where I had carefully cultivated medicinal herbs, plants I had used to treat everything from altitude sickness to digestive problems during my guiding days, had been allowed to fall into complete disrepair. 40 years of careful cultivation of learning which plants thrived at that altitude, of building a sustainable ecosystem that could provide natural remedies, all destroyed by neglect. The pictures showed my herb garden overrun with weeds, the carefully maintained paths I had worn with decades of daily walks, now barely visible under invasive growth. The greenhouse where I had started seedlings each spring was broken and abandoned, its glass panels shattered and its frame rusting in the mountain weather. But the final insult came in the form of a garbage dump behind the cabin. My collection of handcrafted wilderness survival gear tools I had made and modified over decades of guiding experience had been thrown away like trash. My rare nature guidebooks, first editions, that had taken me years to collect and which contained marginalia from my own field observations, were apparently deemed outdated and worthless. The previous owner left behind a lot of old junk, Brenda had written in her social media post. We're so glad to have cleaned up the property and brought it into the modern era. The cabin is much more livable now without all that outdated survival equipment cluttering everything up. Outdated survival equipment. My life's work, my professional tools, my connection to the wilderness that had defined my identity for over 4 decades, dismissed as junk by someone who probably couldn't survive a single night alone in the mountains. The cruelest blow came a month into my stay at Sunny Meadows, when I learned that my grandchildren had been weaponized in a public campaign designed to further cement the narrative of my incompetence and abandonment. A fellow resident showed me a newspaper clipping that her daughter had brought during visiting hours. Ethan and Chloe had participated in a seniors awareness campaign at their school, speaking about the importance of caring for elderly family members. The newspaper article included photos of them holding up drawings of sad grandmas and quotes about how hard it was to care for aging relatives who became difficult and confused. Sometimes, elderly people get really sick and can't take care of themselves anymore, Ethan was quoted as saying. It's sad, but families have to make hard decisions about what's best for everyone. Chloe had contributed her own devastating observation. My grandma used to live alone in the mountains, but she got hurt and couldn't be safe by herself anymore. Sometimes old people think they can do things they really can't do. The article praised their mature understanding of elderly care challenges and their compassionate approach to family difficulties. There was even a photo of them presenting their project to a classroom full of their peers, teaching other children about the realities of caring for aging grandparents. What made it even worse was that I could see how thoroughly they had been coached. These weren't their natural words or genuine feelings. They were parroting exactly what David and Brenda had taught them to say. My grandchildren, who had once begged to spend summers at my cabin learning to identify animal tracks and edible plants, were now unwittingly participating in my public humiliation. The stress of all this, combined with the facility's ongoing neglect and my original injuries, caused my physical health to deteriorate rapidly. I lost 20 pounds in 6 weeks. My skin became sallow and dry, and I found myself sleeping more and more hours each day just to escape the crushing reality of my situation. It was during one of these long, dark afternoons that I heard footsteps in the hallway that sounded different from the institutional shuffle of staff and residents. When I looked up, Eleanor Vance was standing in my doorway, and the sight of her beloved familiar face almost made me weep with relief. Margaret Thompson. She said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for justice, "What in God's name have they done to you?" Eleanor had spent weeks tracking me down through official channels, using her legal expertise and professional connections to locate me, despite David and Lisa's attempts to make me disappear. The sight of my condition, my obvious neglect and deterioration, filled her with the kind of righteous fury that had made her one of the most respected elder law attorneys in the state. She sat beside my bed and pulled a small, worn logbook from her purse. It was one of my wilderness journals, one I had apparently dropped during the chaos of my fall and rescue. Eleanor had found it in the snow near my cabin and kept it safe, knowing it would be important to me. "This belongs to you," she said, pressing the familiar weight of the journal into my hands. "And so does your freedom, your dignity, and your voice. We're going to get you out of here, Margaret. I promise you that." As I held that small piece of my former life, feeling the worn leather cover that had traveled thousands of mountain miles with me, something fundamental shifted inside me. I was still Margaret Thompson, wilderness guide survivor fighter. They had taken my home, my possessions, my grandchildren's love, but they had not taken my spirit. The fight for my life was about to begin, and I had just found my most powerful ally. As winter deepened outside the institutional windows of Sunny Meadows, I felt my connection to the natural world being systematically severed, like a lifeline cut in a mountain emergency. Everything that had sustained me for 68 years, everything that had made me who I was being stripped away with the deliberate cruelty of psychological warfare. The facility was designed to eliminate any trace of the outside world, any reminder that life existed beyond these sterile walls. There were no plants anywhere, not even artificial ones that might trigger memories of the wilderness I loved. The windows were small and positioned high on the walls, offering only glimpses of parking lots and chain-link fences. The exercise area was a concrete courtyard surrounded by tall walls as lifeless as a prison yard. When I tried to share my knowledge about the changing seasons, about the wildlife that would be preparing for spring, about the weather patterns I could read in the sky, the staff looked at me with blank incomprehension or active annoyance. "Mrs. Thompson, we don't need to talk about hiking and animals anymore," one of the younger aides said when I mentioned that the geese would be returning soon. "You're not a guide anymore. You're a resident here, and you need to focus on adjusting to your new life." My attempts to maintain any connection to my former expertise were labeled as agitation or inappropriate behavior. When I tried to explain to another resident how to identify edible plants during our supervised walks in the courtyard, a nurse intervened immediately. "Margaret, you need to stop filling Mrs. Chen's head with dangerous ideas about eating random plants, she said with the condescending tone reserved for confused children. We have nutritionists who plan all the meals here. Just relax and enjoy the fresh air. The systematic deprivation of everything that had given my life meaning was like watching myself die by degrees. I was becoming invisible, not just to my family, but to myself, as every aspect of my identity was declared irrelevant or inappropriate for my new reality. The physical neglect grew worse as the staff became accustomed to my presence and stopped pretending to care about my comfort. My pain medication for the hip and shoulder fractures that still plagued me from my original fall was routinely late or forgotten entirely. I would lie in my narrow bed for hours, writhing in agony, pressing my call button repeatedly until my fingers cramped, only to have someone eventually appear and tell me that my medication wasn't due for another 2 hours. You need to learn to manage your pain better, the head nurse told me during one particularly bad episode. We can't be running in here every time you're uncomfortable. Other residents have learned to cope with their situations. The implication was clear. My pain, my needs, my very existence were inconveniences to be minimized rather than human conditions to be addressed with compassion. I was losing weight rapidly, not just from the stress, but from the institutional food that was served cold at irregular intervals and with the kind of nutritional indifference that suggested they were feeding bodies rather than nourishing human beings. My cries for help with basic hygiene needs were ignored for so long that I began to develop painful bed sores from sitting in soiled clothing. The humiliation of being reduced to someone who couldn't control her own bodily functions, who had to beg for basic cleanliness, was almost more devastating than the physical pain. But perhaps the cruelest torture was the complete emotional abandonment by David and Lisa. Their visits, which had been infrequent and uncomfortable even in the beginning, stopped entirely after the first month. When I asked about them, the staff would deliver rehearsed messages. "Your family called to check on you," they would say with practiced sympathy. "They said you're resting well, and they don't want to disturb your adjustment period." I knew this was a lie. I knew David and Lisa had given explicit instructions that I was not to be allowed phone calls, that visitors were to be discouraged, that I was to be kept isolated from anyone who might advocate for my welfare. The generic greeting cards that occasionally arrived signed with printed names rather than personal messages felt like mockery rather than affection. The psychological warfare reached new depths when a staff member showed me a photograph that had been sent to the facility apparently as proof of David and Lisa's continued community involvement. The photo showed them receiving a Community Spirit Award for their generous donation to a local park's new playground equipment. "Your family is so generous," the aide said, with what seemed like genuine admiration. They donated thousands of dollars to build this beautiful playground for the children in their community. "You must be so proud of how successful they've become." I stared at the photograph, knowing with absolute certainty that the money for that playground had come from the sale of my cabin, from the liquidation of my life's work. They were being publicly praised for their generosity while using my stolen assets to buy social status and community admiration. The caption on the photo read, "So proud to support our community's future," as if they were benevolent philanthropists rather than thieves who had robbed their own mother. The final violation came during what the staff called a routine room inspection, an invasion of privacy that seemed designed to strip away any remaining dignity I might have preserved. They confiscated my remaining wilderness logbooks, the journals where I had recorded decades of observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, plant identification, and survival techniques. These are inappropriate materials for a care facility, the inspector explained, as she loaded my life's work into a box. Residents aren't allowed to keep items that might encourage dangerous thinking about outdoor activities. But confiscating my journals was only the beginning of their plan. Within days, I learned that Brenda had gained access to those private writings and was using them to further destroy my reputation. Another resident's daughter showed me social media posts where Brenda had selectively quoted from my journals, taking passages completely out of context to make me appear delusional or incompetent. A journal entry where I had written, "The mountain speaks to those who know how to listen," was presented as evidence of my dangerous mystical thinking. My careful notes about reading weather signs were twisted into proof of my inability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. Technical descriptions of survival techniques were edited to sound like the ramblings of someone who had lost touch with civilized behavior. Poor Margaret always lived in her own fantasy world, Brenda had written in her post. These journal entries show how disconnected from reality she really was. Thank goodness David and Lisa were able to get her the professional care she needs before she hurt herself or someone else. The comment section filled with people expressing sympathy for my poor family and praising David and Lisa for making such difficult but necessary decisions. My lifetime of genuine expertise, my decades of successful wilderness guiding my ability to keep people safe in dangerous terrain, all of it was being reframed as evidence of mental illness and dangerous delusion. But in the midst of this systematic destruction of my identity and reputation, something unexpected happened. Teresa Martinez, one of the night shift nurses who had been working at Sunny Meadows for over 15 years, began to notice patterns that disturbed her professional conscience. Teresa had seen thousands of elderly residents over the years, and she had developed an ability to distinguish between genuine cognitive decline and deliberate family abandonment. What she observed about my situation didn't match the official narrative in my file. She noticed that I was articulate and coherent during our conversations, that my memory for details was sharp and accurate, that my concerns about my treatment were rational and well-founded. She also noticed that my family's behavior was unusual compared to other residents whose children genuinely cared about their welfare. Most importantly, Teresa began keeping her own detailed notes about the discrepancies between my official care plan and the actual treatment I was receiving. She documented the delayed medications, the ignored call lights, the inadequate hygiene care, and the systematic isolation from outside contact. "Mrs. Thompson," she whispered to me one night during her rounds, "I've been watching how you're being treated here, and it's not right. I can't do much from my position, but I want you to know that someone sees what's really happening to you." Her words gave me the first glimmer of hope I had felt in months. Someone in this place still recognized my humanity, still saw the injustice of my situation. I wasn't invisible after all, and there were still people in the world who believed that elderly people deserved dignity and respect regardless of their family's abandonment. As I lay in my narrow bed that night, listening to the institutional sounds of a place designed to warehouse forgotten people, I felt something stirring inside me that I had thought was lost forever. The wilderness guide who had survived countless mountain emergencies was still alive somewhere beneath the broken, neglected exterior they had created. Teresa Martinez had given me something more valuable than hope. She had given me a witness, someone who could testify to the truth of what was being done to me. And with Eleanor Vance working on the outside and my hidden recording still waiting to be discovered, the elements of my rescue were slowly falling into place. The systematic campaign to silence my voice began, as soon as I started trying to reach out for help from my prison at Sunny Meadows. Every attempt I made to contact the outside world to tell my story to someone who might be able to intervene was met with obstacles that seemed designed to cut off any possibility of rescue or advocacy. My first attempts were simple letters written in my careful handwriting on paper I managed to acquire from the craft activities room. I wrote to Mrs. Patterson, my former climbing partner, who lived in Denver, explaining my situation and begging her to contact Eleanor Vance. I wrote to several other old friends, to the local sheriff's department, even to Mr. Jenkins at Adult Protective Services, detailing the neglect I was experiencing and the circumstances that had led to my imprisonment. But none of my letters ever reached their destinations. I would give them to staff members to mail watching, as they assured me that my correspondence would go out with the daily mail pickup. Days would pass, then weeks, with no responses to urgent pleas for help. It wasn't until I overheard two aides talking in the hallway that I understood what was happening. "Did you throw away those letters from the Thompson woman in room 12? One of them asked. "Yeah, her family left specific instructions that all outgoing mail needs to be screened," the other replied. "Apparently she's been sending paranoid accusations to people who don't need to be bothered by her delusions." My heart sank as I realized that David and Lisa had thought of everything. They had given the facility explicit instructions to intercept my communications, ensuring that no one would hear my side of the story or learn about the conditions I was enduring. My attempts to use the facility's phone were equally futile. When I asked to make calls, I was told that the phone was broken, or that there was a waiting list, or that I would need to wait until after the weekend. When I persisted, asking specifically when I might be able to call Eleanor Vance, the excuses became more elaborate. "Mrs. Thompson, your family has expressed concerns about your tendency to upset people with emotional phone calls," the administrator explained with practiced sympathy. "We think it might be better if you focused on adjusting to your life here, rather than dwelling on the past." Even when I managed to get access to a phone for a few minutes, the calls were monitored and cut off at the first sign that I was trying to explain my real situation. The staff had clearly been trained to listen for inappropriate content and to terminate conversations that might contradict the official narrative about my mental state and care needs. But Eleanor Vance was not someone who gave up easily when she sensed injustice. Having spent decades fighting for elderly clients' rights, she knew the signs of institutional abuse and family manipulation. When she couldn't reach me directly, she filed a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services, citing neglect, isolation, and possible financial abuse. The response to her complaint revealed the full scope of David and Lisa's preparation for exactly this scenario. Within days of Eleanor's filing, Mr. Jenkins received a detailed letter from my family expressing their deep concern about my deteriorating mental state and my tendency to involve well-meaning outsiders in my paranoid delusions. Our mother has unfortunately developed a pattern of making unfounded accusations against family members and care providers, the letter stated. While we understand that concerned neighbors like Mrs. Vance mean well, we must protect both our mother and the community from the distress caused by her increasingly aggressive and inappropriate communications. The letter was expertly crafted to sound like the desperate plea of loving children trying to protect both their mother and innocent third parties from the harmful effects of dementia-related paranoia. It included references to my documented history of mental decline and my dangerous fixation on returning to an isolated living situation that nearly resulted in her death. Brenda, not content with simply blocking my communications, launched a public campaign designed to preemptively discredit anyone who might try to advocate for me. She posted on social media about the heartbreaking challenge of caring for an elderly parent with progressive mental illness who had begun harassing family friends and community members with wild accusations. It's so painful to watch someone you love lose touch with reality, she wrote in a post that generated dozens of sympathetic comments. Margaret has begun calling old friends and making up stories about neglect and abuse. We've had to ask her care facility to monitor her communications because she's upsetting people who care about her, but don't understand that these accusations are symptoms of her condition. The post included a carefully cropped photo of me, looking disoriented and frail, taken during one of my worst days at Sunny Meadows when I was sick with a fever and hadn't been able to eat for days. The image was devastating in its effectiveness, showing exactly what people expected to see when they thought about elderly dementia patients: confusion, fragility, and the kind of tragic decline that would explain away any accusations I might make. When Mr. Jenkins finally visited Sunny Meadows to investigate Eleanor's complaint, he arrived with preconceptions that had been carefully shaped by David and Lisa's narrative. The facility staff, who had been coached on what to say, presented him with fabricated care logs showing that I received excellent treatment and that my complaints were the result of adjustment difficulties and increasing confusion. Mrs. Thompson has been provided with comprehensive care and regular family contact, the administrator assured him. Unfortunately, she has developed some behavioral issues that we're working to address through our specialized dementia care protocols. Mr. Jenkins spent less than 20 minutes with me asking perfunctory questions about my care, while clearly viewing me through the lens of someone he expected to be delusional and unreliable. When I tried to explain my situation to tell him about the financial fraud and the systematic isolation, he nodded with the kind of professional patience reserved for difficult patients. Mrs. Thompson, I understand that adjusting to facility care can be challenging, he said in the tone one might use with a confused child. But your family has ensured that you're receiving excellent care here and continuing to make accusations against people who are trying to help you isn't productive. Before leaving, he issued me a formal warning about disruptive behavior and advised the facility staff to continue monitoring my communications to prevent further harassment of family members and community figures. His visit, which should have been my salvation instead, became another tool for validating my family's narrative and crushing my last hope in the official system. The final blow came when Brenda, having somehow gained access to my remaining personal journals, decided to launch a devastating public attack on my credibility and mental state. She had bribed a staff member to confiscate the logbooks during one of their routine inspections, and now she was using my most private thoughts against me in the cruelest possible way. The excerpts she shared online were masterfully edited to create the impression of dangerous delusion and mental instability. Journal entries, where I had written about the spiritual connection I felt with the wilderness, were presented as evidence of psychotic thinking. Technical descriptions of survival techniques were edited to sound like the fantasies of someone who had lost touch with reality. Listen to these disturbing writings we found in Margaret's room. Brenda posted along with audio recordings of herself reading selected passages with ominous background music. These journals show the depth of her disconnection from reality and her dangerous obsession with isolation and survival fantasies. She had spliced together sentences from different entries, creating passages that never existed in my original writing, but that sounded deeply disturbing when taken out of context. My careful observations about weather patterns became evidence of paranoid thinking about conspiracy theories. My notes about animal behavior were twisted into proof that I believed I could communicate with wildlife. The viral social media campaign reached thousands of people, creating a public narrative that painted me as a delusional old woman whose family was heroically managing her dangerous mental illness. The comment sections filled with praise for David and Lisa's patience and dedication in dealing with such a difficult situation. Thank goodness they got her professional help before she hurt herself or someone else, one commenter wrote. These elderly people who refuse to accept their limitations can be so dangerous. But Teresa Martinez, the night nurse, who had been documenting the truth about my treatment, was also watching these social media posts with growing alarm. Having spent months observing my actual mental state and behavior, she knew that the woman described in Brenda's campaign bore no resemblance to the articulate, rational patient she cared for every night. Teresa began keeping even more detailed notes about the discrepancies between the public narrative and the reality of my situation. She documented every coherent conversation we had, every accurate memory I shared, every rational concern I expressed about my treatment. Most importantly, she began recording evidence of the facility's deliberate neglect and the family's explicit instructions to minimize my care. "Mrs. Thompson," she whispered to me one night as she helped me with medication that had been delayed for hours, "I don't know what your family has done to you, but I know you're not the confused old woman they're pretending you are. Someone needs to hear the truth about what's happening here." Her words gave me strength to endure the crushing weight of being systematically silenced and discredited. Somewhere in the darkness of my situation, witnesses were gathering, evidence was being collected, and the truth was waiting for its moment to emerge. They had taken my voice, but they had not taken my story. And as I lay in my narrow bed that night, I knew that Margaret Thompson was not finished fighting. The turning point came when Eleanor Vance, frustrated by months of bureaucratic stonewalling and official indifference, made a decision that would change everything. Using her decades of experience in elder law and her extensive network of professional contacts, she demanded a full independent review of my case through channels that David and Lisa had not anticipated or controlled. Eleanor had been building her case, methodically documenting every obstacle she encountered in trying to communicate with me every suspicious aspect of my family's behavior, every irregularity in the official handling of my situation. When she learned about Teresa Martinez's observations and the nurse's willingness to testify about the truth of my treatment, she knew she had enough evidence to force a formal hearing. Margaret Thompson has been systematically silenced, isolated, and abused by both her family and the institutional system that was supposed to protect her. Eleanor argued in her formal petition to the State Elder Abuse Review Board. This case represents a textbook example of financial exploitation disguised as concern for an elderly person's welfare. The hearing that resulted from Eleanor's persistence was unlike anything I had experienced during my months of captivity at Sunny Meadows. For the first time since my fall, I found myself in a room where my voice mattered, where people were prepared to listen to my story without prejudging my mental capacity or dismissing my concerns as delusions. I sat at a long conference table flanked by Eleanor and a legal aid attorney she had recruited to represent me. Across from us sat David and Lisa with their lawyer, Mr. Peterson, a man who specialized in defending families against elder abuse allegations. Behind them sat Brenda, looking less confident than I had ever seen her, and Mr. Jenkins, the Adult Protective Services investigator, who was about to learn how badly he had misjudged my situation. This hearing will determine whether Mrs. Margaret Thompson has been the victim of financial exploitation and whether her current care arrangements are appropriate for her needs and wishes," announced the hearing officer, a retired judge who had seen countless cases of family betrayal and institutional neglect. Eleanor stood and addressed the panel with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years fighting for justice. "Your Honor, what we will present today is evidence of a calculated scheme to defraud an elderly woman of her life, savings, her property, and her basic human dignity. Mrs. Thompson's own family has systematically stripped her of her autonomy, stolen her assets, and condemned her to institutional neglect while publicly portraying themselves as caring relatives making difficult decisions. The first piece of evidence Eleanor presented was my hiking GPS device, the small piece of technology that had been recording ambient sound during my rescue and the conversations that followed. David and Lisa's faces went pale as they realized what Eleanor was holding. This device contains unedited audio recordings of conversations that took place in Mrs. Thompson's presence during her recovery, Eleanor explained. These recordings reveal the true motivations behind the decisions that led to her institutionalization. As the audio began to play, filling the hearing room with the voices of David and Lisa discussing their plans for my future, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Every word they had spoken, every cold calculation about my financial value, every dismissive comment about my needs and dignity was preserved in crystal clear digital quality. David's voice, discussing their credit card debt and their plan to sell my cabin for profit, seemed to echo in the stunned silence of the hearing room. Lisa's weak protests, quickly overcome by her agreement to the scheme, showed her complicity in what was clearly a calculated plan to exploit my vulnerability. "She's just a burden we can't handle anymore," David's recorded voice stated with chilling indifference. "The cabin sale will cover our debts and still leave us with a nice cushion. Once she's in that facility, she'll have no legal standing to contest anything." Mr. Jenkins, the Adult Protective Services investigator who had dismissed my concerns and issued warnings about my disruptive behavior, sat frozen in his chair as he listened to the evidence he had failed to discover or chose to ignore. His face showed a progression of emotions from surprise to shock to profound shame as he realized how completely he had been manipulated by David and Lisa's carefully constructed narrative. When the recordings finished, Mr. Jenkins stood up slowly, his professional composure cracking under the weight of his own negligence. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I owe you a profound and public apology. I failed in my duty to protect you, and I allowed myself to be deceived by people who should have been caring for your welfare." He turned to address the hearing panel, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "I was completely wrong in my assessment of this case. Mrs. Thompson's complaints were legitimate, her concerns were justified, and I failed to investigate thoroughly because I accepted her family's representation without proper verification. I pledged to do everything in my power to rectify this injustice." But the most devastating moment came when David was called to testify about the recordings and his treatment of me. As he walked to the witness chair, his confident demeanor was already beginning to crumble under the weight of the undeniable evidence of his cruelty and greed. Eleanor's questioning was methodical and relentless, forcing David to confront each recorded statement, each calculated decision to prioritize his financial needs over my welfare. When she played the recording of him discussing the cabin sale as pure profit, while I was lying injured and vulnerable, David's carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely. It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, his voice breaking as tears began streaming down his face. "We just needed the money so badly, and she was hurt, and we thought she would be better off with professional care." But as Eleanor continued to press him about the systematic isolation, the intercepted communications, the deliberate neglect, David's explanations became increasingly incoherent. The weight of months of guilt and the exposure of his actions in front of witnesses who could no longer be deceived finally broke through his defenses. "She's right," he suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "It was always about the money we left her to rot in that place because we needed her assets and we didn't want to deal with taking care of her. We're the ones who should be ashamed." The courtroom fell silent as David collapsed into uncontrollable sobbing, his public breakdown revealing the depth of his guilt and the complete collapse of any justification for his actions. Watching my son destroy himself with his own confession was heartbreaking, even knowing everything he had done to me. Lisa sat motionless beside him, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed her husband's complete psychological collapse and faced the undeniable truth of their actions. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked directly at me with what appeared to be genuine remorse rather than the practiced sympathy she had performed for months. Brenda, who had orchestrated so much of the public campaign against me, avoided all eye contact and seemed to shrink into her chair as she realized that her carefully constructed narrative had been exposed as elaborate fiction. The confident woman who had posted social media updates about my mental decline was now faced with objective evidence of her own participation in systematic abuse. As the hearing concluded with a unanimous finding in my favor, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. Justice was being served, but the cost had been the complete destruction of my family relationships and the public exposure of just how far human greed could drive people to betray those they claimed to love. But more than anything, I felt the profound relief of finally being heard, of having my truth acknowledged by people with the power to act on it. Margaret Thompson was no longer a silenced victim warehoused in an institutional facility. I was a human being whose dignity and rights had been restored and whose voice would be heard once again. The fight for my freedom was far from over, but the most important battle had been won, the battle for my truth. The swift and decisive action that followed my hearing was unlike anything I had experienced during my months of powerlessness at Sunny Meadows. Within 72 hours of David's public breakdown and confession, Adult Protective Services issued a comprehensive ruling that would fundamentally change not just my life, but the lives of countless other elderly people who had suffered similar abuse. The formal findings were devastating in their clarity and scope. David and Lisa were found guilty of criminal elder neglect, financial exploitation, and systematic abandonment under state elder abuse statutes. The evidence was so overwhelming, the recordings so damning, that there was no possibility of appeal or negotiation. Based on the extensive evidence presented, including audio recordings, witness testimony, and documented patterns of neglect and exploitation, the APS ruling stated, "We find that Margaret Thompson has been the victim of systematic elder abuse perpetrated by her immediate family members. The defendants are hereby ordered to assume full financial and practical responsibility for Mrs. Thompson's care, including immediate placement in a high-quality facility of her choosing or provision of comprehensive in-home care as she desires." But the consequences extended far beyond financial restitution. David and Lisa faced formal sanctions that would follow them for the rest of their lives, including mandatory registration on the state's Elder Abuse Offender Registry. The case was automatically referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution, and both of them faced the possibility of felony charges that could result in significant prison time. The public reprimand was issued immediately, creating a permanent record of their crimes that would be accessible to any future employer, volunteer organization, or professional licensing board they might encounter. Their reputations, so carefully cultivated over decades of suburban respectability, were destroyed overnight. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the investigation that Eleanor's legal team launched into Sunny Meadows itself and the broader network of substandard care facilities that warehoused vulnerable elderly people throughout the state. What they discovered was a systematic pattern of abuse that extended far beyond my individual case. The investigative journalist that Eleanor had recruited, Sarah Chen, spent weeks documenting conditions at Sunny Meadows and similar facilities. Her expose, published simultaneously in print and broadcast media, revealed horrifying patterns of neglect, financial exploitation, and deliberate isolation of residents whose families wanted them to disappear. What we found was not just individual cases of abuse, but institutional policies designed to maximize profit while providing minimal care, Sarah reported on the evening news. Facilities like Sunny Meadows deliberately target elderly people whose families want to avoid the responsibility of care, creating a system where abuse is not just tolerated, but economically incentivized. The story went viral, nationally triggering investigations in dozens of other states and prompting congressional hearings on elder care oversight. Within months, Sunny Meadows lost its state licensing and was forced to close permanently. The facility's corporate owners faced millions of dollars in fines and lawsuits from families of residents who had suffered similar abuse. More importantly, the investigation led to the discovery of hundreds of other cases similar to mine. Elderly people who had been declared incompetent by family members seeking access to their assets, residents who had been systematically isolated from outside contact patients whose medical care had been deliberately minimized to reduce costs while families pocketed the savings. Margaret Thompson's courage in fighting for her rights has exposed a crisis that affects thousands of elderly Americans, Eleanor told the media. Her case has become a catalyst for fundamental reform in how we protect our most vulnerable citizens from exploitation by both their families and the institutions we trust to care for them. The personal consequences for David were swift and devastating. Within a week of the ruling, he had lost his job as the public scandal made it impossible for his employer to retain him. The shame and legal pressure drove him to what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown, and he was admitted to a rehabilitation facility for what his remaining lawyer described as severe depression and substance abuse issues. The letter I received from him 2 months later was written on institutional stationery and bore little resemblance to the confident, manipulative man who had orchestrated my imprisonment. His handwriting was shaky, his words rambling and desperate. "Mom," he wrote, "I know there are no words that can undo what I've done to you. Sitting here in this place, getting the help I should have sought years ago, I can finally see the monster I became. The greed, the selfishness, the complete lack of humanity I showed toward the woman who gave me life and raised me with love and integrity." He went on to detail his recognition of how far he had fallen, how the financial pressures and Brenda's influence had corrupted his judgment until he could rationalize the most heinous betrayal of family bonds. But what struck me most was his acknowledgement that the damage was irreversible. "I know I can never earn your forgiveness," he continued. "I know I can never be the son you deserved, and I know that our relationship is destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. All I can do is ensure that you receive everything you're entitled to and try to live with the knowledge of what I've become. Brenda's fate was even more isolating. As the full scope of her role in orchestrating my abuse became public, even David began to distance himself from her. The divorce papers were filed within months of the hearing, leaving her completely alone to face the social and legal consequences of her actions. The woman who had once commanded social media attention with her carefully curated posts about family success and community involvement now lived in complete social isolation. Her former friends avoided her, her professional network disappeared, and she found herself working retail jobs under an assumed name to avoid the recognition that would bring fresh waves of public condemnation. But amidst all this destruction and accountability, something beautiful began to emerge from the wreckage of my family. Lisa, who had been silent and complicit for so long, finally found the courage to seek me out and confront the full scope of her betrayal. I was living temporarily in a high-quality, assisted living facility that I had chosen myself, funded by the mandatory restitution David was required to pay, when Lisa appeared at my door one afternoon with tears streaming down her face and her children Ethan and Chloe standing nervously behind her. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, "I don't know how to begin to apologize for what I've done to you. I was so afraid of David, so intimidated by Brenda, so worried about my own family's security that I convinced myself you really were sick and that we were doing the right thing." She spent hours telling me about the fear that had paralyzed her, the way David and Brenda had gradually isolated family members who might have supported me, the threats about financial ruin if she didn't cooperate with their plans. But more importantly, she spoke about her commitment to making amends in whatever way possible. "I want to be your daughter again," she said through her tears. "I want to take care of you the way you took care of me all those years. I want my children to know their real grandmother, not the confused old woman that David and Brenda created in their imagination." Ethan and Chloe, now 16 and 14, had been deeply traumatized by their father's public breakdown and the revelation of his crimes. They approached me with the tentative uncertainty of children who had been taught to see me as a burden, but were now struggling to understand how they had been manipulated. "Grandma," Ethan said quietly, "I said terrible things to you. I believed Dad and Brenda when they said you were sick and confused. I want to know who you really are, not the person they told me you were." Chloe, always more emotional than her brother, simply wrapped her arms around me and sobbed. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm so sorry we let them hurt you." As I sat in my comfortable new apartment that evening, surrounded by Lisa and her children, listening to them ask questions about my real life, as a wilderness guide, about the adventures I had experienced, about the knowledge I had gained over decades of mountain living, I felt something I had thought was lost forever, the possibility of authentic family connection. The victory was complete in terms of justice and accountability, but it was bittersweet in its human cost. David was broken and distant, possibly irreparably damaged by his own choices and their consequences. But Lisa and her children were on a genuine path toward healing and redemption, and that gave me hope for the future. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and my autonomy. Margaret Thompson was no longer a victim to be pitied or a burden to be managed. I was a survivor who had fought for truth and won, and whose story was already inspiring others to stand up for their own rights and dignity. The fight had been agonizing, but it had ultimately liberated not just me, but countless others who would benefit from the reforms and awareness that my case had generated. Sometimes, the most important victories are the ones that transform individual suffering into collective progress. 2 years have passed since the hearing that changed everything, and as I sit in the sunroom of my beautiful assisted living apartment, watching the morning light illuminate the small garden I've been tending, I can honestly say that my life has been transformed in ways I never could have imagined during those dark months at Sunny Meadows. The apartment I chose for myself is everything that institutional facility was not: spacious, bright, filled with plants and personal belongings that reflect who I really am. My hiking boots sit by the door, polished and ready for the gentle walks I take through the facility's extensive grounds. My compass rests on the bookshelf beside volumes of wilderness guides and journals that document not just my past adventures, but my ongoing observations about the natural world that still captivates me. Most importantly, I made this choice myself. The comprehensive care plan that David is legally required to fund gives me complete autonomy over my living situation, my medical care, and my daily activities. I am no longer someone whose decisions are made by others. I am a woman in control of her own life, supported by excellent care, but never controlled by it. The physical transformation has been remarkable. With proper nutrition, appropriate medical care, and the psychological healing that comes from dignity restored, I have regained much of the strength and vitality that systematic neglect had stolen from me. My hair has grown back thick and silver, my eyes are bright and alert, and my voice carries the authority of someone who knows she will be heard and respected. But the most profound transformation has been in my relationship with Lisa and her children. What began as desperate attempts at reconciliation has blossomed into the kind of authentic family bond that I had thought was lost forever. Lisa visits me at least 3 times a week, and we have built a routine of shared activities that bring us both joy. Mom, she told me recently as we worked together in my small garden, I feel like I'm getting to know you for the first time as an adult. All those years when I was too busy with my own life to really listen to your stories, to understand what an extraordinary person you are, what an incredible life you've lived. We spend hours talking about my decades as a wilderness guide, about the adventures she had never bothered to ask about when she was consumed with suburban concerns and social pressures. I tell her about the time I guided a family through a 3-day blizzard, about the rare wildflowers I discovered at high altitude, about the techniques I developed for reading weather patterns and animal behavior. Lisa listens with the fascination of someone discovering hidden treasure, taking notes about family history that she wants to preserve for her children. She has become not just my daughter again, but my friend, my advocate, and my connection to a future I am helping to shape. Ethan and Chloe, now 17 and 15, have embraced their grandmother's true identity with the enthusiasm of teenagers who have discovered that their family story is far more interesting than they had ever imagined. They spend weekends with me learning wilderness skills, helping with my advocacy work, and asking endless questions about my adventures and the knowledge I gained over decades of mountain living. Grandma, can you teach me to read animal tracks? Chloe asked during her last visit. And can you show me how to identify edible plants? I want to know all the things you know. Ethan, initially embarrassed by his past cruelty toward me, has channeled his remorse into genuine curiosity about wilderness survival and environmental conservation. He's planning to study forestry in college, inspired by stories of his grandmother's life in the mountains and her deep understanding of natural ecosystems. I want to be like you, Grandma, he told me with the sincerity that only comes from true admiration. I want to live a life that matters, that connects me to something bigger than just making money or impressing people. David remains a distant and tragic figure in our rebuilt family structure. His letters arrive occasionally filled with rambling apologies and desperate pleas for forgiveness that I read with sadness, but without anger. He has been permanently damaged by his choices, his life irrevocably altered by the consequences of his greed and the public shame of his exposure. I know I can never undo what I've done, his latest letter read. I know I can never be part of your life again, and I know that's a consequence I deserve. All I can do is make sure the financial support continues and hope that someday, somehow, the good you're doing in the world will balance out some of the evil I brought into it. His recognition of the permanent nature of our estrangement is accurate. While I have forgiven him in my heart, I cannot forget the systematic cruelty he showed me when I was at my most vulnerable. Trust once shattered so completely cannot be rebuilt through letters of remorse, no matter how genuine they might be. Brenda has faded into complete irrelevance, living a solitary existence that stands in stark contrast to the vibrant, purposeful life I have built from the ashes of her betrayal. Sometimes I see updates about her through mutual acquaintances, descriptions of a bitter, isolated woman consumed by the consequences of her own actions. I feel no satisfaction in her suffering, only a profound sadness for the waste of human potential that comes from choosing cruelty over compassion. But the most meaningful aspect of my transformation has been my emergence as a national advocate for elder rights and dignity in long-term care. Working with Eleanor Vance and the network of allies who helped rescue me from Sunny Meadows, I have become a voice for countless elderly people who face similar abuse and exploitation. My memoir, Reclaiming the Mountain, A Wilderness Guide's Fight for Dignity, became a bestseller and sparked national conversations about elder abuse, family exploitation, and the urgent need for better oversight of care facilities. The book tour took me to dozens of cities where I spoke to packed auditoriums about the warning signs of elder abuse and the importance of maintaining autonomy and dignity regardless of age or physical limitations. Your age does not diminish your worth, I tell audiences wherever I speak. Your need for assistance does not make you a burden. Your experience and wisdom are valuable resources that should be honored, not dismissed. And your voice matters no matter who tries to silence it. The speaking engagements and advocacy work have given my life a sense of purpose that extends far beyond my personal recovery. I work with legislators to strengthen elder protection laws, with facility administrators to improve care standards, and with families to recognize the warning signs of abuse before it reaches the level of systematic exploitation. Most importantly, I mentor other elder abuse survivors, helping them find their voices, navigate the legal system, and rebuild their lives after betrayal by those they trusted most. My apartment has become a gathering place for a support group of women who understand the unique pain of family abandonment and institutional neglect. Margaret saved my life. One of the group members, Dorothy, told a reporter recently. She showed me that being old doesn't mean being powerless, that being vulnerable doesn't mean being voiceless. She taught me to fight for my dignity and my rights, and now I'm teaching my own grandchildren that elderly people deserve respect, not just tolerance. Every evening, as I sit in my comfortable chair overlooking the gardens where I've planted native mountain wildflowers, I feel a profound sense of completion that has nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The abuse I endured was devastating, but it led to a purpose and a platform that I never could have achieved without that terrible journey through darkness. My victory was not just personal, it was transformational for countless others who will benefit from the awareness, the legal reforms, and the cultural changes that my case helped to generate. The wilderness guide, who had spent decades helping people navigate dangerous terrain, had found her greatest calling in helping people navigate the treacherous landscape of aging in America. Margaret Thompson was no longer just a survivor. She was a leader, an advocate, and a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been told they were too old, too frail, or too inconvenient to matter. The mountain I had climbed was not made of stone and snow, but of human cruelty and institutional indifference, and reaching its summit had taught me that no terrain is too difficult to conquer when you refuse to surrender your dignity and your truth. As I sit in my garden this peaceful Sunday morning, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, I find myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that brought me from the depths of institutional despair to this moment of profound contentment and purpose. At 70, I am not the same woman who was betrayed and abandoned by her own family 3 years ago. I am stronger, wiser, and filled with a mission that transcends the pain of what I endured. The mountain cabin that was once stolen from me has been restored to my ownership through the legal settlement, though I chose not to return to the isolation that once defined my life. Instead, it serves as a retreat center for elder abuse survivors, a place where people who have lost their voices can come to rediscover their strength and dignity. Lisa manages the property with love and reverence, ensuring that it remains a sanctuary for healing rather than a monument to past suffering. My current life in the assisted living community I chose for myself represents everything that institutional care should be: respectful, supportive, and empowering rather than controlling. Young staff members seek me out for stories about wilderness survival and life lessons learned through decades of self-reliance. I am not seen as a burden to be managed, but as a resource to be valued, and a person whose experience enriches the community. The relationship I have rebuilt with Lisa and her children has become the most treasured aspect of my new life. We have created authentic bonds based on truth, respect, and genuine affection rather than obligation or guilt. Ethan and Chloe know their grandmother not as the confused old woman David and Brenda portrayed, but as the accomplished wilderness guide who spent her life helping others navigate challenging terrain, both literal and metaphorical. Through my advocacy work, my memoir, and my mentoring of other survivors, I have transformed my personal trauma into a powerful force for protecting vulnerable elderly people across the nation. The laws that have been strengthened, the facilities that have been reformed, and the families that have been educated about elder abuse, prevention, all represent a living legacy that extends far beyond my individual experience. Perhaps most importantly, I have learned that dignity cannot be taken from you. It can only be surrendered. The systematic abuse I endured was designed to convince me that I was powerless, worthless, and voiceless. But beneath the fear and manipulation, Margaret Thompson, the wilderness guide, who had never met a challenge she couldn't overcome, was still alive and waiting for her moment to fight back. To anyone listening to my story who may be facing their own battles with family betrayal, institutional neglect, or the challenge of maintaining dignity in the face of aging and vulnerability, I want you to know this: your voice has power, your experience has value, and your fight for respect and autonomy matters more than you can possibly imagine. The path forward may be more difficult than you expect, but it leads to a place of peace and purpose that no one can ever take away from you. The betrayal I endured was devastating, but it was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of my most important chapter 1, where I learned that true victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from reclaiming your truth and using it to protect others who face similar battles. Today, as I prepare for another week of meaningful work, surrounded by people who respect and value my contributions, I can say with absolute certainty that justice does prevail, dignity can be reclaimed, and it is never too late to transform your pain into purpose and live with the freedom that comes from knowing your life has made a profound difference in the world.